The Tucker car, created by Preston Tucker, was the result of his lifelong passion for automobiles. He wanted to create something unique that would change the automotive world. He battled against the marketing might of the big three auto giants and a staggering court fight that brought him down. But his dream endured, and the Tucker became a legend. The car that Preston Tucker created in the late 1940s still excites the public. It doesn't look like anything else from that era. Tucker's car captured the public's imagination after the war. They wanted to see this small-town entrepreneur succeed. Tucker never strayed far from his Ypsilanti, Michigan hometown. Surrounded by auto plants, he developed a love for cars. He fixed up his first car and sold it when he was just 16. He had a knack for tinkering and kept at it, eventually turning his auto refurbishing hobby into a business. His love of speed prompted him to take a job with a local police department. He loved being able to legally drive fast. His mother disapproved, and Tucker quit the force. Like many other young men in Michigan, he took an auto assembly job. This was no fun, and Tucker leapt at an offer to sell cars at a dealership. He started to blossom.
He was a pretty polished man. He never was without a suit. He bought his suits in New York. They were all white linen suits. He wasn't school taught, never went to college, but he had sold cars his whole life and sold other things, and he was one of those people that would light up a room when he'd walk in.
Selling luxury cars provided him enough money to travel to the Indianapolis 500 race every year.
It's race day at Indianapolis.
He loved watching the cars, meeting the drivers, the engineers, and the heads of the companies.
Racing cars compete in the
He learned about the latest technical developments
100-mile classic.
and became a part of the racing world.
Does that take skill?
Tucker most admired race car builder Harry Miller. His engines had won the most Indy 500s. By 1934, Tucker and Miller were collaborating on a race car project funded by Edsel Ford. They had only 10 months to put the car together. Even though they worked non-stop, they couldn't properly test the car before the race. The Miller-Tuckers were unproven, and it didn't look as though Miller was going to get his 8th consecutive win. The race was hard on the cars. The steering gears locked up, and all 3 of his cars dropped out before the finish. There was no checkered flag or hoopla for Tucker that year. But several people thought the cars had promise. After some modifications, they ran at Indy until 1948. Time was Tucker's enemy. He returned to his Ypsilanti, Michigan home and started to think about his next venture. He heard that the Dutch government was worried about being invaded by Germany. They wanted a light combat vehicle for defense. He set up shop behind his house and began work on a lethal hot rod. This fast and maneuverable vehicle was quite impressive. It had bulletproof glass and large headlights that did double duty as searchlights. Tucker used a Harry Miller design for the engine. This propelled the car at over 100 miles per hour. Its 3 machine guns and anti-aircraft gun were capable of spewing out 2,800 rounds a minute. Tucker wasn't able to deliver any of his cars because the Dutch proved right. The Germans overran the country. Tucker thought the American military would want to buy his cars, but the army was already at work on the Jeep. While they passed on the car, they liked the gun turret. This 360-degree turret could turn and fire without missing a beat. This impressed the Navy. It was perfect for the new PT boats and landing craft. They asked Tucker to help build the turrets and the boats. He spent the war as a shipbuilder, but dreamed of being able someday to build cars. He learned about manufacturing and decided he could apply his lessons and become an automaker. America had escaped the devastation that Europe suffered, and the post-war era was poised for a boom. Families were in a hurry to buy homes and new cars. But Detroit's automakers were slow to convert from war production and didn't have much available that was new. Tucker thought this gave him an opportunity to jump in. He started looking for money and searching for a suitable factory. He found one in Chicago, a Dodge plant that had been used during the war to build aircraft engines. It was the largest facility under one roof at that time. More than 30,000 workers had built over 18,000 engines every month during the war. They kept the B-29 bombers flying. Tucker thought this grand factory would be perfect for his automotive dream project. He put in a bid on the surplus plant. He won and was allowed to move in. But the War Assets Administration was thinking of giving it to another company. Returning GIs needed housing, and the government was under pressure to find a solution to the housing crunch.
President Truman
signed a housing bill, and this encouraged Lustron, the builder of prefabricated homes, to ask the government for Tucker's factory.
for the construction of 100,000 housing units.
The government agreed that it would be better to use the plant for homes. They gave it to Lustron.
And he won't see it penned up.
Tucker turned to union leader Walter Reuther to help him fight the decision. They argued that far more jobs would be created building cars than building prefab homes. Finally, the government relented and let Tucker stay. But he'd lost time that he needed to design, engineer, build, and market a new car. His first step was to find the right designer for his dream.
Preston Tucker was looking for a good designer and asked people in Detroit who's the best automotive designer they know, and they all said the same thing, George S. Lawson.
Lawson created a radical rocket-like car design that was way ahead of anything Detroit was making. But Tucker felt he needed something a little less fantastic and hired a seasoned designer, Alex Tremulous, on Christmas Day in 1946. He gave Tremulous 6 days to create a final design for the car. He was ready by New Year's Eve to show Tucker some sketches. Tucker approved, and they were off. They built a small-scale model and then turned to making one full-sized. They first built a wooden shell and sculpted modeling clay on top of it. It started to look like a car. Tucker motivated people, made them feel they were part of a team.
And he wasn't a guy that I believe people worked for as much as they worked with. because he had the uncanny ability to hire people that could get the job done. And therefore he'd say to you, I don't care how long it takes you, but be sure it's right when it's done.
People pitched in and worked long hours to create all the parts needed to build a new car. Tucker introduced innovations like the steering mechanism placed behind the axle to reduce the likelihood that the steering wheel would impale a driver during a collision. He insisted that the car be rear-engined but not air-cooled like the Volkswagen. This would give it traction but not eliminate the problem of freezing radiators in the winter. A rolling test chassis was finally ready, and it looked like a car would soon follow. Tucker launched an ad campaign that promoted the cars as being ahead of anything else on the road. The clock was ticking, and the team struggled to get ready for the world premiere, scheduled for July 17th, 1947. Buses brought in over 3,000 people to the plant who wanted to witness the launch of Tucker's dream. They had lunch in shifts and toured the factory. Finally, it was time for Preston Tucker to announce the moment they'd all been waiting for. Tucker kept talking and talking while they waited. Behind the curtain, mechanics frantically tried to finish the car. The fuel injection system was acting up and the suspension broke. The crowd sensed something was wrong, but Tucker kept talking. He excused himself to peek behind the curtain. He said, "Let's push it out and get on with it." They did, and the crowd went wild when the car appeared from behind the drapes. Tucker's daughters joined him on stage for the big moment. He was the beaming father with a new baby, his car. He invited the mechanics out too, and then posed for pictures with the whole family. When his daughter christened the car, he was soaked with flying champagne. But nothing could mar the day. It was the culmination of his lifelong love affair with cars. His whole family was there to celebrate and show they approved of his mechanical obsession. There was nowhere to go but up. The public and the press responded to Tucker's new car. This was something that stood out. The rear engine gave it a flat floor pan and a roomy interior. Tucker said it was big enough for 6 pro football players. Its unique Cyclops headlight moved when the car turned. Tucker said this unusual idea made it safer. It reminded some of the searchlights on his combat car. This and the aerodynamic styling made the car unique. The biggest problem was the engine. It just wasn't working right. He assembled a team at his home in Michigan to fix the problem. They started to experiment with Lycoming aircraft engines. These were too big. The Franklin helicopter engine had the proper dimensions, and he bought 4. But he didn't think the public was ready for air-cooled engines and converted the Franklins to water-cooled. The new engine worked, and he bought the company to ensure his supply. Before he could begin serious production, the car had to be thoroughly tested. But the press was clamoring for time in the cars. Tucker let one reporter take an early prototype out. It was having transmission trouble. An article appeared saying the car couldn't back up A minor adjustment had fixed the problem, but the article created havoc. It began to sow doubt about the Tucker car. Tucker took it all in stride and began a campaign to build a network of dealers. He planned to begin production. Stock had been issued, and he'd raised over $17 million. He had money, a factory, and his new car. But he needed more money to produce the cars. In the spring of 1948, he launched the Tucker Accessories program. He wanted to raise money by selling radios and other accessories to people while they waited for their cars to be built. He took in $2 million selling accessories, but he caught the eye of the stock regulators, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They began to investigate, but Tucker was able to use the money to build more prototypes and to promote them.
The first completely new car in 50 years. This car differs from other cars in many features. We have tried to design a car designed around the slender profiling. This car is designed mainly around safety features. We have some 67 safety features. This car will be on the market soon. We have had our first showing publicly of this car here in Minneapolis to our dealers and distributors from 3 states around here. The car is moving on to Seattle on the next stop. Thank you.
While Tucker promoted the car, the SEC moved ahead with its investigation. They asked for all the company's records, even though this meant he'd have to stop running his company if he complied. In June of 1948, there was a devastating broadcast. The biggest personality of the day, Drew Pearson, announced that the SEC was going to move on Tucker. Tucker's stock dropped from $5 a share to $2. $6 million in value was erased. The accessories program was dead. Creditors demanded to be paid. Suppliers would only take cash. To show Pearson that the company and the car were viable, Tucker paraded a lineup of cars outside Pearson's office. Pearson refused to look. Tucker had no choice, and he agreed to let the SEC have his records. He had to close the plant and lay off 1,600 employees. 37 Tuckers sat in the factory. His problems grew worse, but he put on a cheery face for the world to see.
I'm sure he had worries, but I don't think he was a worrying kind of a person. He just kind of, an obstacle would come up and he'd say, okay, here's what we're going to do with it, and he'd move on to the next thing.
Not everyone was intent on taking Tucker down. A writer for Mechanics Illustrated thought that Tucker was fantastic and wrote a glowing review. He liked the handling, the roomy interior, and told the public it was a car worth seeing. But Tucker really needed to raise some money and get things moving again. To drum up more favorable publicity, he staged a performance and endurance test at the Indianapolis Speedway. The cars did everything right, even when there was an accident. One of the test drivers rolled a car while going 100 miles per hour. But when he walked away with barely a scratch, it seemed to prove that Tuckers were safer than other cars. The public and the media were impressed, but the government was still deciding what to do. By the fall of 1948, his bank account was down to $8 million. Not enough to restart the production line. A skeleton crew was all that was left at the plant when the U.S. Attorney in Chicago announced a grand jury investigation. A confident Tucker said he welcomed the opportunity to meet with the grand jury. Tucker drove up to the courthouse in a shiny blue Tucker 48. A curious crowd formed around the car. Some people began to believe Tucker was a victim of a conspiracy by the big three automakers who didn't want the competition. In June of 1949, Tucker and 7 of his associates were indicted for fraud by the grand jury.
Once you got him into court, Preston was doomed. He couldn't be pursuing this company, which was basically holding on by a string, and fight a battle in court at the same time. So it really only took a matter of weeks that he would be out of business, and I think they knew that.
Things didn't look good. The government charged that he never delivered what he promised. But the prosecution witnesses were not very impressive. Preston had hope when the jury got the case in January of 1950. While Tucker and his wife waited, the jury deliberated. It took only 17 hours for them to reach a decision. Tucker was exonerated.
He was acquitted in a short trial after no defense. He said, "There's been no offense, so there'll be no defense." Those are the exact words. And the jury acquitted him, but then the confidence of the people was gone. So the order slowed down a little bit, but still he didn't have the mechanism in place to really be building cars.
He was free, but out of business. The court ordered that the creditors needed to be paid and appointed trustees to sell everything. They sold it all except for Franklin Motors. They kept that until 1973. Of course, Tucker had been forced out. But he kept up his spirits and went to work planning a new car. Brazilian investors wanted him to build something there. Unfortunately, he died of cancer in December of 1953, before he could launch his Brazilian comeback. He faded into history until Francis Ford Coppola made a movie about him. Jeff Bridges played Preston Tucker and brought the story to life.
Once the movie came out, the cars went from 66,000 to 300,000.
These rare and now pricey cars are still much admired. Preston Tucker is still a hero to the devoted fans of his cars. Many believe that he was too much of a threat to Detroit's automakers. He had a truly innovative car ready for production, while they were trying to sell warmed-over models from the 1930s. The controversy adds to the mystique.
Well, it's like any kind of thing that's there's very few of it. It becomes very exotic, and it's yesterday going to the museum and seeing 2 of them side by side or across from each other. It's just awe-inspiring.
Those lucky enough to own a Tucker enjoy the experience of driving the cars.
On Sundays, we'll take the car out and we'll take it for a drive around the town, and people will wave and honk, and sometimes they'll try to stop us and say, "Are you the Reddies that own the car?" And I'll say, "Yes, we are." And they'd say, "Great, cool," and thumbs up and everything. So it's neat.
Preston Tucker tried to build the most advanced automobile of his time. He was a dreamer who believed that anything was possible in America. While the company was crushed, the spirit that motivated Tucker to create his dream machine still inspires us today.